Ni hao, annyeong. Hello, I am the Dark Fae, and welcome back to Confessions of a First-Time Dungeon Master. Excuse the crazy makeup. I was having fun with some new makeup and filming, so that is the reason for all of this. But as always, if you missed the last session, I'll put a link to it up in the corner over here for you. You can go check it out, catch up on what you missed, and come back here to find out what happened next. We're now on session 40. I can't believe it's 40, and I've been DMing for more than a year now. So let's get into it. Okay, so this one is going to be a little bit shorter because it was a bit of a shorter session. One of our players kind of couldn't make it kind of at the last minute, and so with what I had prepped, it's a little bit awkward to kind of go forward without all of them there. So anyways, we started this session in the middle of combat. So these are 5 players are kind of fighting these 2 large, essentially gibbering, and it's gibbering, I looked it up, these 2 gibbering mouthers. And this is where I get a little concerned with, not with them, but with me and how I'm scaling encounters, because I don't know if my gauge of encounter difficulty is off, or if it was just the dice rolls that ended up making it really difficult. But these were modified gibbering mouthers. Now granted, I did bump their stats up a little bit, bumped up some of the DC, so I'll show you the gibbering mouther stats here. For the gibbering feature, I did bump up the wisdom DC from a 10 to a 14. Since this is difficult tower, 14 has kind of been about the DC that have been setting. Maybe I should have made that a 13, but and then for the strength save to keep from losing your movement, I did bump that from a 10 to a 12. So not massive bumps. And then the only other thing that I really changed, they're a little bit more dexy, but that really only affects saving throws and their initiative, and that didn't really come into play. Bump to strength didn't really come into play. And then they, instead of having a +2 to hit, they had a +5, which, going against people with decently high armor classes, minus Basil, who I think has a 13 or 14, my thought was that when trying to hit with someone with a 16, 17, 18, 19 armor class, that could potentially bump up with their reactions, like shield, or I believe Tyrell has a defensive duelist feat that lets him add +2 to his AC, maybe +3. Like a gibbering mouther is gonna have to roll 13, like, what is that, 12, 11, 12, 13, 14, or higher in order to hit, depending on what character, obviously. And so I think the +5 is generally a much lower attack bonus than I've had before. Normally I do around +6, +7, maybe +8 if the thing is really difficult. And then in terms of AC and armor class, a gibbering mouther's AC is normally 9, and they have like 67 hit points, I think it is. So I did bump that up slightly since a party of 5 high-level characters. So I did bump up the AC to 14, and the hit points to about 90, 92. With an AC of 14, I mean, most of them have around a +6 to a +8 to hit. So really, that's, you gotta roll a 5 or lower, roll an 8 or lower. It's a pretty high chance that they're going to hit this creature, given that they make their saves. So, I think I also gave them kind of a multi-attack, because action economy, 5 characters, 2, potentially 3 of which have multi-attack or, spells and stuff like that. I think that this encounter should skew in favor, if not heavily in favor, of the party. But this encounter somehow ended up much more difficult than I was expecting. It might have been just a combination of some really bad rolls on their end for saving throws or attacks. And then I was rolling really well in the encounter, and just it was kind of like if the players are here, it just kind of kept shifting. Because I think I rolled a natural 20 on a bite, which a bite by a Gibbering Mather does a lot. It's 5d6, so I was rolling 10d6, and I think I got 2 crits. Even with, and then a lot of their attacks were just really unlucky. Like Valkyrie had transformed into an elk, and she couldn't really attack very consistently. Umrik's spiritual weapon kept missing. Tyrell kept failing his wisdom saves, so he was kind of stuck outside the room for like 3 rounds. And then at one point, the blinding spittle hit 3 of them. It aimed at Valkyrie, so it also, the splash damage hit Basil and Ivar. And then they all failed their dex saves, which is a dex of 13, which is it's on the easier side in terms of DCs. And then they all rolled a 12 and below, like a 12, an 8, and a 7. And I was just so utterly like aghast, because then they're getting blinded, they're getting knocked prone, they're losing their turns. Although towards the end, I think they started rolling better against the wisdom saves. It was really only Tyrell, but like I don't think the higher DC and the confusion effect really was the sole cause of like the problems with this combat that they had. Part of it was the crit too. But at some point, it knocked both Basil and Ivar unconscious. And one of the things that it has when it kills someone is that it consumes them. Well, I didn't count knock unconscious as consuming or as killing. So what I basically ruled was that as you were unconscious, it kind of starts to kind of form around you and like fuse you to its body as it starts to eat you and try to devour you. So they're essentially grappled. Not restrained, grappled only. So yeah, Basil rolled another natural 20 on his first death save. So I think that's his 3rd one now, where he just has picked up. And now it's like canon almost, the fact that he can't die. And that frustrates me as a DM, because now I kind of want to kill him. But actually there was another difficult part of this encounter where Ivar was unconscious. Basil wanted to heal him, but he was blind. And Healing Word states that it must be a creature you can see. He's blind. He can't see anyone, so no healing. But eventually, they were able to pick everyone up. Nobody died. And Tyrell did kill steal one of the Gibbering Mothers, as is per usual. And eventually, they're able to do away with these Gibbering Mothers, and they just kind of dissolve into the floor, into this, like, crusted over mass of, like, gross, fleshy blobbiness. Umrik is the one closest to the pit, and he has a high passive perception, being a cleric with a high wisdom. So, I tell him basically that you can get the sense that the pit is not empty. It's basically full of, like, this Gibbering Mother stuff, and like it can just kind of separate and just like kind of spit out new ones. So they're like, okay, we're gonna go. So they rush through the door. Valkyrie is still an elk, so like the key doesn't really activate, so they just go through. And so now this is kind of where the introduction to the new room begins, and this is kind of why I wanted everyone to be here for this, and I'll explain why. So essentially they're heading into the bedchamber. And no, not like that. But so they walk through the door, and it's kind of essentially a Dark Souls fog wall where they kind of are walking through this empty, misty space, and they start to lose track of each other. And then each of them gets kind of put into their own nightmare sequence. And this was a lot of fun to write, honestly. It was a lot of me kind of talking at them, but I did try to give each of them some chances to kind of do something in this dream, and I'll detail what each of them kind of roughly went through. Some may be worse than others. You tell me down in the comments below who had it worst. So, we went in order of their marching order. So first was Valhyrie. So Valhyrie, basically, she found herself standing back on the borders of her home, the Forest of Rot, in the city of Tag Rapport. So basically, behind her is the forest, ahead of her is the city, and she decides to kind of head forward to see whether the city will hold more answers. And as she approaches, basically, she sees someone from her hometown kind of crawling on the ground in pain, and there's these dark, kind of greenish veins kind of spreading across their skin, and they reach out and they start to almost petrify into wood, and like branches kind of growing from their back, from their arms, from their legs, roots kind of digging into the ground, as this kind of figure then transforms kind of into a humanoid-ish shaped tree. This kind of dark sludge like pouring from their mouth and from their eyes. And then, so she continues further into the city and sees that the once kind of great splendor of her city is now just kind of taken over by this wild tangle of kind of putrid greenery, and all the people around her are in similar transformations, some of them also transforming into these tree-like figures, some just like dissolving into this sludge, some becoming these like deformed, twisted looking animals that are just kind of writhing in agony on the ground. And then after she kind of witnesses this, the scene kind of shifts her and she's pulled into the forest where these vines and roots kind of start to entangle her and trap her, because she did fail her dexterity saving throw. So they manage to constrict her and they start to pull her underneath the ground as it kind of like opens up to kind of let her sink. And then these roots all kind of wriggle through the ground to kind of pierce into her body at different points, and they start to kind of like siphon her blood and her life in order to feed them. And she kind of realizes and becomes a part of this alive, dark, restless, hungry kind of a forest. And then her vision kind of fades to black. So after each of these kind of scenes, I have them make a wisdom saving throw. Luckily, Valhyrie's wisdom is high, and she succeeds all of them, except the last one, but then she uses a luck point and is fine. So she's the only one actually who made all of her wisdom saves, and I'll explain what they do later. But each person had a total of 4 wisdom saving throws to make, each one meaning different things. So next up was, I believe, Umric. So Umric, he found himself in like a village that he doesn't really know, with like people, families around him, people shopping, children running through the streets and playing. And then as he watches slowly, one by one, all of the people, they start to decay, their bodies becoming kind of emaciated, the flesh kind of sloughing off of them as they become these corpses now, still running around, still moving as if they were people, but now just these walking undead. So that's one wisdom saving throw. And then as he's watching, he has a mark that's on his forearm of a skull with kind of engulfed in like green flames. And so this burst of green flame kind of radiates from him and catches all of these now undead people in this kind of green inferno, and they're caught ablaze, like screaming, reaching towards him, saying like, "Why have you done this? You did this to us. This is your fault." Another wisdom saving throw. And so he kind of just goes off, continues walking through, and then the ground beneath him starts to sink as well, and these corpses now are kind of latching onto him, kind of piling on top of him, and from the earth as well, there are more bodies being unburied and unearthed, and they also kind of start to climb on top of him as he starts to like suffocate beneath this growing pile of corpses. And so that's another wisdom saving throw. And then lastly, there is a kind of scream of pain that he realizes is emanating from him, and his like being, the things that like make him Umric are now kind of being siphoned away, but he can't do anything about it. And then all he can kind of feel is a presence of all these other bodies and souls within him, and there's just this tide and ebb of agony that just continues. And then he hears a whisper, like a voice that sounds sad or disappointed, that kind of, it is the same as it was. And then his vision starts to fade, and that's one more and final wisdom save. And then his dream sequence is done. Tyrell would be next, but we had to do his a little bit afterward. But his was basically, he found himself in 3 different scenarios where he was kind of in chains. He was like a prisoner. The first, he was in a jail cell kept, and he kind of watches as several guards drag his sister, Taffy, by, and they kind of gesture to the window behind him. He looks out to see that they are marching her up to a gallows, and he's kind of helpless as he watches his sister hang by the neck until dead. That's one wisdom save. The second scene, now he is kind of chained to a post that's beside him, and in front of him, his sister is likewise tied with her hands kind of behind her back against a large stake. And then there are archers kind of lined up, firing squad style, as who seems to be in charge, like the captain, kind of seems expectant of something. Tyrell catches on and kind of says, "Is it the sword? Is it the sword that you want? Like, I don't have it." And he makes an investigation check, rolls a natural 1, so comes up with nothing, and then they execute his sister by arrows through the abdomen, through the chest, through the throat, and he watches her die. Third scene, he is in an office-like space, again chained, guards around him. This time his sister is being held with a blade to her neck. As again, the captain, waiting for something expectantly, he rolls another investigation check. This time comes up with a thick, kind of broad sword with a ruby in the hilt, but it's not the right one. The captain kind of just tosses it aside. They cut his sister's throat and throw her body at his feet. He watches her kind of bleed out, so that's another wisdom save. Obviously, wisdom save happening every time he watches his sister be murdered. And then, lastly, what happens is he's transported to this kind of empty space, when all of a sudden this kind of sonorous clanging sounds from the ceiling, when out of like nothingness, it seems this just pile of swords and weapons just come crashing down and filling the space around him. And he's like compelled to like frantically search and search and search, like ending up cutting himself on all the different blades as they continue to grow and threaten to bury him. And then his blood dripping onto the ground, coating the weapons, and slowly too this pool of blood just kind of starts to rise until it overtakes him, and he basically drowns in a pool of weapons and blood. And that's his final wisdom saving throw before it cuts to black. Cheerful, I know. Next up is Ivar, and he finds himself standing kind of in a wild area, kind of a lot of forests and hills. But he quickly realizes he can see the Tower of Elithmalar in the distance, and realizes he's in the wrong side of the chasm. He is somewhere in the country of Verdak, which is home to shape-shifting, cannibalistic flesh monsters that just devour and devour, based off of the knolls of Yenogu. But much creepier and nightmare fuel-esque. So basically, he kind of takes a look around. So this kind of triggers his memories as a warforged, someone who is made to fight these things. And I have him roll a wisdom saving throw. Kind of funny, during this, he was like, when he like realizes where he was, he's like, "Uh-oh, I'm afraid." I'm like, "That's why you're rolling a wisdom saving throw." And so then he makes a perception check, succeeds, and so I tell him he hears a rustle in the bushes behind him. These lands are mostly uninhabited, probably doesn't spell anything good. So he goes to check for signs kind of these creatures, these flesh rovers. And while he does, he kind of is searching and then turns to see one of them kind of looming up above him, this kind of a bare head with just kind of this open, like fleshy kind of mouth, just like full of jagged teeth, and it seems to be sitting on like 3 sets of rib cages. And then it kind of tackles him, and then more kind of emerge. Some that have like 2 heads, some that have like too many arms, too many limbs. There's just too many teeth and bones, and they all kind of descend upon him, and that's another wisdom save. So now his vision is kind of taken from him as it expands outward into the world, and he sees these creatures kind of crawling across the chasm, crawling up the tower of Elith Malar, much like ants crawl onto a corpse or carcass. Sometimes they change into his likeness to become kind of the warforged fighters, or sometimes into the mages that he once served, but nevertheless they are always tearing and rending and consuming the people in Elith Malar. He also sees them kind of tear across the mountains that have held the flesh rovers in for decades or centuries. And every town they come upon, every civilization, they just rip and kill and eat. So that is another wisdom saving throw. There's a sharp pain in his arm that kind of jolts him back to himself, but it's like different than he remembers when he's been made of metal and wood, being a warforged. So he turns to look as he feels this like warm pooling kind of at his wrist, or at his forearm. He sees that his arm is now made of flesh and bone and blood. Another pain kind of at his leg, and leg again is human. It's made of skin and bone as well, as these flesh rovers have started to tear into and bite into him. And basically he gets the feeling of being devoured alive. And that's another wisdom saving throw before his vision too goes dark. Oof. Lastly is Basil, and might I say, up until now, they've been rolling some pretty decent saving throws. They've failed a couple of them, but for the most part, not too bad. Umric, I think, only failed 1, but I will get to that later. So they've been rolling pretty well, and it's been pretty good, and then it becomes to Basil. So Basil, a little similar to Ivar, he finds himself standing at the very edge of the chasm, though on the correct side of Elith Malar. It's familiar to him, and yet not, because there is a barrier that is supposed to separate the chasm from Elith Malar, but he reaches his hand through to where it should be, and it's not there. And so whispers then begin to rise up out of the chasm, and that is 1 wisdom saving throw. So now, which he rolls like an 8, so he does fail that. And then now these like shadowy hands start to appear out of the chasm, kind of lurching over the sides. I have him make a dexterity or strength saving throw to see if he can keep from them pulling him in. He rolls like a 11 or like a 9 something. It's not good. So the arms kind of clutch onto his arms and legs and just pull him into the chasm where more and more hands and claws kind of reach out to pull and grab at him. And that is another wisdom saving throw. So now he's just falling in this perpetual kind of roiling, breathing darkness for how long, he doesn't know. But eventually he stops. The voice is kind of quiet, and around him is just this clear emptiness. Then light starts to appear as images of the outside world kind of spread and form in the ground kind of around him. He sees kind of the Tower of Eloth Malar, he sees the Siskorian Keep, he even sees like the Ukasi Forest where they traveled before, these places where he's familiar. And he watches as this kind of same spinning, breathing, living darkness that's kind of around him now just kind of surges forward and just barrels kind of into all of these places, like overwhelming them and turns them into wastelands. The people kind of overtaken by more of these shadowy creatures that just kind of envelop them and turn them into dust. The trees of the forests kind of twist and rot and die, and everything just turns kind of into a wasteland. And that's another wisdom saving throw. So as he watches this, there is kind of a presence around him. Eyes start to appear, bloop, 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 in the darkness around him, all watching him. And he sees like he can kind of feel the presence of something near him, like a faint breeze, but every time he turns to look, it's gone. Tendrils of red hair kind of snake around him as two hands kind of rest on his shoulders, and he essentially hears, "Thank you, darling, for getting all this started." And so that is his final wisdom saving throw before the figure disappears, and then he is like cast into darkness again. So, that was a lot. That was some of my storytelling. I don't want to say at its finest, but I am pretty damn proud of those nightmare sequences, and I had plans for if things succeeded or if they ran a different way, something like that. So I'm pretty proud of those dream sequences, nightmare sequences, question your soul and your entire being sequences. But essentially now, each of those wisdom saves, the first two correspond to a possibility of a short-term madness, the other two long-term. I was originally going to have the last one be indefinite, because since that's like, the most mad. But looking at the madness tables, I decided I didn't really like the indefinite madness portion, since that is, I feel like, more on the players to roleplay, and is a bit, I think, can feel a bit like unimportant or like just thrown to the wayside. I don't really have a way to like enforce, that, hey, you have this madness trait. So instead I decided on short-term and long-term, which have very immediate and very potentially bad side effects. So they're going to find out what madnesses they get in the next session, because that is where we ended it, because now they're going into the bedchamber. Again, not like that. And I didn't want to do it without one of the party there to be able to react, and without knowing what his madnesses, if any, were. So let me see. So Valhyria is the only one who passed all of her checks. Imric failed one long-term. Teyral failed 2 short-term and 1 long-term. Ivar failed 1 short, 1 long. And Basil failed all of them. He didn't roll above a 15. So I'm a little bit concerned because they're really tapped and they just took, well, half of them just took a long rest. The 2 wisdom-based characters took a long rest a little while ago, but there's one madness in particular that might be a bit cumbersome to deal with, and they can't. Long-term madness can be cured, but it's more a question of whether they have the spell slots to spare, and they still have 2 rooms, which are less combat based, but they still have 2 rooms and the Oni. And if they want, maybe the foyer still. So it's a moment where I kind of have to reconsider my initial plans for this tower, because when I first introduced this tower, I hadn't really prepped everything because it was just so much to prep, and I didn't have the time to plan it all out beforehand to know what they were getting into. And then I got a bit carried away because it was really fun and really interesting to come up with the different mechanics and the different puzzles and the different encounters, and each one is unique and like tailored to a different room, and it was just a lot of fun. But now I'm getting worried. Like, what if they can't succeed? What if this is the TPK? Oh god. Or what are the ramifications if they fail their contract, or if they maybe succeed in one portion but don't succeed in killing the master? There's like things that I need to, or like, can I give them another long rest? Is that, if that feels like too much, because the way they split up their rests in the first place, and then, because if they got by with the bare minimum of combat, I think they'd be fine, honestly. But fighting the jailer didn't take, it took 1 third level spell essentially, so that wasn't actually too bad. And then there's the statue they did pretty well with, but then they decided to fight the librarian, and then the gibbering mouthers, they kind of, because they killed the librarian, made it more difficult to succeed in that, and so then you had to fight those. I don't know. It'll be something I have to monitor for sure, but for now I'm still keeping my original plan of what this final encounter is going to be. So let's see if this will be like a recurring villain kind of a thing, because now I'm thinking this might be more along the lines of like the inevitable end, or like Oban, or the laughing hand kind of a deal in Critical Role. That's like my idea, my thought. So we'll see. You can't always succeed, right? But thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for notifications when I put out new videos. I love you all, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!